Detroit is the only major American city where ring-necked pheasants outnumber pedestrians on entire residential blocks. It's the only city where coyotes have set up more than 1,000 territories inside the city limits. It's the only place in America where you can drive in a straight line for 8 miles, never leave the city, and never pass a single working business. And what's happened here doesn't fit any category American urban planning was ever built to handle. Every collapse story you've heard about an American city is wrong about Detroit. Detroit isn't a failed Chicago. It isn't a broken New York. And it isn't a city that decayed. It's a city that emptied. And in the process of emptying, it became something else entirely. In 1950, Detroit was the 4th largest city in the United States, with 1.85 million residents. Today, it has 633,000. That's a 66% population loss, and in absolute terms, it's the largest ever recorded in a major American city. No other top 30 city in the country has lost even half that proportion. Detroit didn't slip down the rankings. It walked off the chart. And then it kept walking, declining every single year without exception for 64 consecutive years from 1958 all the way to 2022. But the raw numbers don't capture what Detroit actually became. To understand that, you have to first understand what every other American city was doing while Detroit was emptying out. The American urban template is remarkably consistent. A major city begins with a dense industrial or commercial core. As the city grows, density radiates outward. Neighborhoods densify, then suburbs form a halo around them. Then exurbs form a halo around the suburbs. Wealth flows inward and poverty pushes outward. Some neighborhoods decline, some gentrify. But the core almost always survives, because the core is the reason the city exists. Chicago has lost neighborhoods. New York has lost industries. San Francisco has lost middle-class families. Boston has lost manufacturing. But the cores of those cities have never gone hollow. They have never been emptied. Detroit is the only major American city where the core itself emptied. Not declined, emptied. The grid is still there. The streets are still paved, the water mains still run, but the people, the businesses, the institutions that once filled them have left, and in many neighborhoods, they did not leave behind decay. They left behind absence. And that distinction between decay and absence is the whole story. The mechanism behind Detroit's inversion comes down to a single decision the city made in the early 20th century. It bet everything on one industry. No other major American city did this. Chicago had meatpacking, but it also had finance, transportation, manufacturing, and retail. Philadelphia had steel, but it also had pharmaceuticals, shipping, and textiles. New York had finance and ports and publishing and garments. But Detroit had cars. Just cars. The auto industry consumed the city's geography. It consumed its labor market. It consumed its political class. And it consumed its demographic structure. By the 1920s, more than half of Detroit's working population was directly or indirectly employed by the automotive sector. The city became, in effect, a one-company town the size of Manhattan. And it worked beautifully for 30 years. Detroit became the arsenal of democracy. It built the bombers and the tanks that won World War II. It absorbed waves of European immigrants and southern black migrants who came north for assembly line jobs that paid middle-class wages to people with no college education. And in 1950, the whole system hit its peak. Detroit was the 4th largest city in America. It produced more automobiles than the next 3 countries combined. Its population was 83% white. Its industry was booming, and its tax base was the envy of every mayor in the country. And then, immediately, the inversion began. The decentralization of the auto industry started almost the moment the peak was reached. Through the 1950s and 60s, the Big Three, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, along with their primary labor force organized through the UAW, started moving plants out of the city core and into the suburbs. The UAW had negotiated strong wage and benefit packages that made urban factory operations increasingly expensive and the Big Three built new factories where land was cheaper, where they could design for the new post-war reality of car-dependent suburbia. The factories that built the city were the same factories that walked away from it. White flight followed the factories. Between 1950 and 1980, Detroit's white population fell 95%. The 1967 Detroit riot, sometimes called the 12th Street riot, accelerated everything, but the trend was already locked in. By 1980, the city had gone from 83% white to 34% white in just 3 decades. The middle class, black and white, left for the suburbs, and as the Big Three globalized through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the economic spine of the city was pulled outward and then offshored entirely. Every other American city that lost an industry replaced it with another. Pittsburgh replaced steel with healthcare and education. Cleveland replaced steel with medicine. Youngstown, Ohio, just 90 miles to the east, tried to manage its own steel collapse and became one of the first American cities to formally plan around population loss rather than fight it. Boston replaced manufacturing with biotech and universities. Detroit replaced the auto industry with nothing. There was no plan B. There was no diversification. The monoculture that built the city was also the only thing keeping it upright, and when it left, there was no second pillar to catch the fall. That's when the Prairie began to appear. By 2012, the city of Detroit, which sits on 138 square miles of land, contained roughly 40 square miles of vacant land. Nearly a third of the entire city was empty. 80,000 homes sat abandoned. The Detroit Land Bank Authority, the public agency responsible for managing the city's stockpile of vacant and tax-foreclosed properties, was overseeing more parcels than it had the resources to address. Entire blocks that had held 30 or 40 single-family houses now held one. The famous comparison that you could fit Manhattan, Boston, and San Francisco inside Detroit's city limits with room to spare became the most cited statistic about the city. There is a twist that actually strengthens the point. Detroit is not unusually large. It is only the 18th biggest city by land area among the 20 most populous American cities. Manhattan, Boston, and San Francisco are unusually small and dense, not the other way around. Detroit is normal-sized. It just got emptied out. And that is the entire categorical difference. Every other American city of Detroit's land area is full. Detroit is the only one that ran out of people to put inside it. The vacant land cost the city money in ways most Americans never think about. Police and fire services still had to cover those 40 square miles. Water and sewer lines still ran beneath them. Streetlights still tried to illuminate streets where no one lived. By one estimate, every square mile of vacancy cost the city $9 million a year in emergency services alone. The city was paying to maintain a footprint built for 2 million people, with the tax base of a city of 600,000. The math was never going to work, and it didn't. But the most striking thing about the emptying isn't financial, it's biological. Because the prairie isn't a metaphor, it is, literally, a prairie. The first hint came in the 1980s, when a few Detroiters started noticing ring-necked pheasants in the tall grass of abandoned lots. Pheasants are grassland birds. They aren't urban animals. They live in fields and rural prairies. They had been brought to Michigan from China in the 1890s and thrived on small family farms for a few decades before mechanized agriculture displaced them. By the 1970s, pheasants were a rural relic in this part of the country, except somehow in Detroit. As the city emptied, the lots filled in with 3-foot grass. The grass attracted insects. The insects attracted the pheasants. And the pheasants, having no real predators inside the city limits, multiplied. Today, according to the Detroit Audubon Society, Detroit is the only major American city in the country where wild game birds walk on urban streets. You don't see this in New York. You don't see this in Chicago. You don't see this in San Francisco. The Detroit-based filmmaker who made a documentary about them put it plainly. This is unique to Detroit. Other Detroiters describe a different version of the same thing. They say everyone in Detroit eventually has a pheasant story. And the pheasants are only the beginning. Detroit now hosts more than 250 species of birds inside its city limits, including wild turkeys, peregrine falcons, and bald eagles. Coyote populations inside the city are estimated at more than 1,000 individuals. Foxes hunt on residential porches. Beavers have returned to the city's waterways after an absence of nearly 100 years, and they are building dams along urban creeks. Ecologists studying the city have started using the phrase the Detroit phenomenon as a recognized scientific term for rapid biodiversity recovery in a post-industrial city core. That phrase does not exist in the literature of any other American city, because no other American city has produced the conditions for it. This is the inversion at its most concrete. Every other American city is built around the suppression of wilderness. Sidewalks, lawns, planters, pest control, animal control, the entire infrastructure of American urbanism is designed to keep nature out of the urban interior. Detroit is the only American city where nature walked back in through the front door, took up residence on streets that still have working addresses, and stayed. And Detroiters, increasingly, are not trying to kick it out. The North Corktown Neighborhood Association has started campaigning to preserve vacant lots as pheasant habitat. Bird sanctuaries are being established on what used to be foreclosed residential parcels. Detroit's official planning documents now include language about preserving accidental habitat as a feature of the city, not a flaw. The bankruptcy made the inversion official. On July 18, 2013, emergency manager Kevin Orr, appointed by the state of Michigan to take over the city's finances, filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection on Detroit's behalf. The debt was estimated at between $18 billion and $20 billion. It was the largest municipal bankruptcy filing in the history of the United States by debt, more than 4 times larger than the previous record holder. And it was the largest by population too, more than double the size of Stockton, California, which had filed the year before. The case was presided over by federal bankruptcy judge Stephen Rhodes. Detroit exited bankruptcy 17 months later, having shed more than $7 billion of its debt. The exit was widely covered as a success story. And it was. But what gets lost in the recovery narrative is what the bankruptcy actually proved. Detroit had, by every measurable institutional standard, fallen out of the normal range of American urban experience. No other major American city has ever had to file Chapter 9. Detroit did not slip into a bad version of being an American city. It stepped outside the category entirely. Which brings us, finally, to the reframe the data has been building toward this whole time. Detroit isn't a failed city. It's the country's first successful post-industrial shrinking city. And there's a meaningful difference between those two things. A failed city collapses and disappears. That's what happened to mining towns and mill towns and frontier towns by the thousands across 19th and 20th century America. A shrinking city contracts and stabilizes at a smaller scale, learning to live with less. That second category is rare in the United States and almost completely absent from the American urban imagination, but it's the norm in much of Europe and East Asia, where industrial cities have been shrinking for 50 years. Leipzig, Germany, for example, lost 30% of its population between 1989 and 2000, and lost more than 60,000 housing units in the process, before engineering one of Europe's more studied managed shrinkage recoveries. American planners had no template for it, because no American city had ever done it at scale. Until Detroit did. The vacant land became gardens, then farms, then habitat. The empty footprints became development opportunities at a fraction of coastal city prices. Real estate investors like Dan Gilbert, founder of Quicken Loans, poured billions into the downtown core through his company Bedrock Detroit, betting that the city's rock-bottom prices represented a floor, not a ceiling. The bankruptcy reset the city's debts. And in 2023, for the first time since 1957, the U.S. Census Bureau reported that Detroit had gained population. Not a lot. Fewer than 2,000 people. But for the first time in 65 years, the line moved in the right direction. The Prairie isn't going anywhere. The pheasants are still on 2nd Avenue. The foxes are still on the porches. The bankruptcy is still in the history books. The 65% population loss is still in the census data. Detroit is still, by every structural measure, the opposite of every other major American city. It's denser at the edges than at the center. It's governed by absence rather than density. And it's defined by what isn't there rather than what is. But the city has finally found a way to be those things without continuing to collapse. It has, in its inverted, contradictory, emptied-out shape, become something no other American city has ever been. A city that learned how to shrink without dying. Every major American city is built on the assumption that growth is the goal, that the only acceptable trajectory is up and to the right. Detroit is the only one that found out, the hard way, what happens when you stop pretending. And what's left behind, somehow, has more wildlife than most of America's national parks.